Hi, I'm Rachel Schrommen. I'm an estate planning and elder law attorney and owner of Schrommen Law LLC located in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm also a woman in long-term recovery, and what that means to me is I've been sober and working an active recovery program since 2012. Today I'm going to share with you a bit about my personal story, my journey in recovery, and my path to sobriety. And I'm also going to talk with you about the work I do professionally in working with families impacted by substance use disorder. More specifically, we'll be talking about addiction trust planning and how that can help a family plan for a way that supports and promotes the recovery of their loved ones and doesn't enable their use. So before I get into the work I do as a lawyer, I'm going to share with you a little bit more about my personal recovery story, which starts when I was quite young. I grew up in a smaller town in Iowa, and alcoholism is something that runs in my family. So I definitely inherited that trait genetically. I had my first drink when I was 14. And in the community I grew up in, I was kind of behind the curve. A lot of people my age had already drank. Some had been using recreational drugs even before that age. And the first time that I drank, I can see in hindsight that it was very apparent that I didn't react like a normal person would. That my reaction to ingesting alcohol was definitely evident that I had substance use disorder. The first time that I drank until I got sick. I was with a friend, same age as me, and we took shots of triple sec until it made us throw up, which didn't take long. And her reaction was to say, "Oh my gosh, that was awful. I feel horrible. I'm going to go lay on the couch." And my reaction was, "That was amazing. I love this. I'm going to stay here and keep drinking." And of course, at that time, I didn't know that was abnormal. I didn't care. Alcohol had a pretty strong hold on me from right away. I wanted to keep drinking that day, and that continued. In hindsight, I can see that as a very obvious, early on, initial indication that I was and am an alcoholic. So started drinking when I was 14. It became a priority for me. It was what I thought about most of the time, what I did with most of my free time. Fell in with the party crowd, was drinking and using a lot. At the same time, though, I've always been very type A. I'm very high functioning. I always have very high standards for myself, set high goals. And so even though I was using and living this, partying life and out drinking, etc., I still was very high achieving. So, in high school, I was in choir and show choir and the school musicals and AP classes and honors classes and volunteering at the Red Cross and volunteering at the nursing home, on and on. I got scholarships to college. I sat on student senate. I spoke at statewide conferences to faculty on behalf of issues on campuses. And that's relevant. And the reason I bring it up is kind of twofold. One, there was always, and it still is kind of said, there was a perception that things were always going very well. I was still very high achieving. I've heard, I've been told that I was a very high functioning alcoholic, that I had a very, very high bottom. Those are two phrases I hear or have heard. And, for myself, still being very high achieving, it was really like I was leading these dual lives. In one regard, I was, drinking to excess. I was very active in my disease, but on the other hand, I was still achieving all these things. So if my, and I'm sure there were times that it was, by my parents, friends, family, or otherwise, if it was ever brought to my attention that I had less than ideal behavior or my drinking or use was causing concern, I would think, well, if that was such an issue, how would I be doing this? And I think sometimes that might have been the perception or the reaction of people around me. And that's something that, was a lie that I told myself and functioned to keep me active in my disease for as long as I was. In terms of, when I did get sober, and I'll talk a little bit about that, I was in law school. In the summer I got sober, I was taking summer courses. I was going through law school on a near full ride scholarship. I was working for a judge in the courts. I owned my home and I was renting to two other students. It appeared from the outside that I was very high functioning, that I had it all together, but it could not have felt more opposite. I was emotionally and spiritually bankrupt. I was miserable. I was doing it, doing what I was supposed to be doing, but barely. It was like 1 minute to the next, just barely hanging on. And that's something that developed and mounted and increased throughout the time period that I was using, which was about 10 years, which is, I'm grateful. That's a short period of time. I drank from 14 to 24. I'm very grateful that I got sober as early as I did. But, the disease progressed pretty quickly for me. Based on my personal experience and, my own beliefs, I do believe that the disease of addiction alcoholism is progressive. It was certainly what I experienced. The more I used, the older I got, the harder it got for me to control it. And what I mean by that is, being type A, when I was in high school and college, I could set certain things in place to kind of control my drinking. So for example, if I had a homework assignment, that was getting done before I went out with friends. If I had class at 8 a.m, which by the way, I usually tried to make certain I had class at 8 a.m. every day. If I had class at 8 a.m., very high likelihood I would not go out the night before. It was that type A and high drive that allowed me to kind of stay in the lane with those types of things in place. Of course, over time, they became less and less effective, which, leads to my getting sober. So when I went to law school was a whole new level of stress and pressure and hard work and, intimidation and fear than I had ever experienced. And when I was faced with that, it really put under a magnifying glass that I had one tool for coping. If I felt scared, tired, stressed, anxious, sad, fearful, happy, needing to celebrate, angry, anything, the only way I could manage those feelings was to drink. And with those feelings, increasing and getting kind of piled on in law school, my drinking only increased. The law school I attended provided therapists to students at close to no cost to help us manage the stress and anxiety that can come with law school. And I worked with a therapist there who was also very, very well versed in addiction and alcoholism, as many therapists who work primarily with lawyers and law students are. It's something that, really affects the legal field and professionals working in the legal field. And, in working with her, which it really started focusing on anxiety and the pressures and stress of law school, she was able to, guide me and help me as I moved towards having the clarity and the realization that I had a problem and I needed help. The summer I got sober was kind of the perfect storm of events that happened. I was working for a judge, and most days she just saw typical civil type of matters, speeding tickets, things like that. But one day a week, she presided over drug court. And in Minnesota, we have, specialty courts, and drug court is one of them. And it is a court that exists where if there's a defendant who is a drug addict and they meet certain criteria that it's anticipated they'll be successful in drug court, rather than getting sent to prison or receiving a prison sentence, they can participate in drug court. And it is a very regimented, hands-on program that supports them in their recovery. So they'll have a defense attorney. There'll also be a prosecuting attorney. The judge is involved in this. There's social workers. They're requiring and helping these individuals to find a job, etc. And it was towards the middle of the summer that I finally worked a Thursday morning for this judge. I was working around my class schedule, and I sat in on drug court, and it was my first exposure to a conversation around alcoholism and addiction that was a conversation that recognized it as a disease, that was not judgmental of it, that accepted with a very serious level of understanding that it is hard work for some individuals, for individuals impacted by substance use disorder, to get sober, that it is something that doesn't happen overnight, that it is something that can be tried and tried again and easily derailed. And to, be doing work with this therapist that understood recovery and addiction and could, was guiding me on that path, and then sit in a room of individuals that, as a law student, I absolutely held practicing attorneys and judges on a pedestal, even more so than I do now. And to have individuals that as a student, I so looked up to and just, held up on this pedestal and admired and respected and strove to be like, to have them have a conversation in front of me, a conversation of empathy and support and understanding of someone struggling with substance use disorder, was a big deal for me. And it allowed me to, I work a 12-step program in my personal recovery. It allowed me to do my first step sitting in a courtroom, watching a judge interact with individuals participating in drug court. And, by the grace of God, sitting in that courtroom, I was able to have the clarity, to have the ability to be honest with myself, to say, I'm identifying with the journey that these individuals in drug court are on, with the struggles that they're explaining, with the ways they react to life and how they're talking about it. That's ringing a little true for me. And, I brought that up with my therapist. I had done my first step. The light bulb went off that I have a problem. I can't control this. I don't want to be stuck in this cycle anymore. I want to get better and I need help. And communicated that to the therapist I was working with at the law school, and she connected me with a group called Lawyers Concerned for Lawyers. And it was working with an attorney who was also in recovery. She connected me with a 12-step program. I threw myself into that. The recovery community program, or recovery community in St. Paul, is phenomenal. So I just became very involved in that. And that is how I found recovery and how I have stayed sober. And my life in recovery now, I still work an active program. I work with women in the program. And, recovery has it's given me a life where I'm thriving, the ability to do important self-work, to repair relationships, to build relationships and friendships that are important to me. My recovery is one of the hardest things I've ever done, even compared to law school. What I am most personally proud of, even compared to law school. And what I hold as most important and first and foremost in my life. Without my recovery, I would not have anything else. I wouldn't have my relationships, the relationships I have with my family that I do. I would not have my marriage. I would not have my law practice. So it's a little background about me and my recovery. Now I'll talk more about what I do professionally and how I work with families that are impacted by substance use disorder as well. So before I get into that, I'll give you a disclaimer like a typical lawyer. So I am an attorney in Minnesota. I am only licensed in Minnesota. I'm going to talk about addiction trust planning on kind of a general level, more the benefits of addiction trust planning, ways you might think about addiction trust planning, where it's a good idea, what types of goals it can meet. Nothing I talk about should be construed as legal advice to anyone viewing this personally. This is a complex area of law, and you should get advice from a licensed attorney in your state that is specific to your unique situation. This is very, very fact-driven, which will become evident as I talk about it in more detail. Also, again, I'm only licensed in Minnesota. Anything that I talk about in terms of the law or legal documents is based only on my knowledge of Minnesota law. When you contact an attorney, you want to contact an attorney in your state that knows the laws of your state that apply to you and your family. So with addiction trust planning, I'll back up. So when I was in law school, I was an elder justice scholar, which means I focused my education on elder law, namely medical assistance planning, and also estate planning. So wills, trusts, powers of attorney, and attorneys, in fact, or powers of attorney and healthcare directives. When I started my practice, I was receiving referrals for families impacted by substance use disorder. In my professional world, I'm open about the fact I'm in recovery. It's something I'm proud of. It's a part of my life I'm very proud of. I live and work in a community that is very accepting of, there's not a lot of stigma in St. Paul, at least that I haven't experienced. So I'm in a community where it's safe for me to be professionally open about being in recovery. And I'm an advocate for reducing the stigma, and part of that is being open about my own experience. So with other professionals knowing that that's part of my story, an important part of my life, I would get referrals for families who are impacted by substance use disorder. In fact, there's a statistic that 1 in 7 individuals over the age of 12 have substance use disorder. And this is more than, heart disease, it's more than cancer. It's a lot of people are affected personally by this, and that just ripples out to families. So these families were coming in more and more, and the conversation would generally start like this. And this is a big generalization because, of course, every conversation is different. Every family is very different. But this is a pretty typical way that I was initially identifying clients impacted by substance use disorder, is a couple would come in, and they would say something along these lines. They'd say, we have 3 children. Greg and Jerry are our 2 sons, and Amanda's our daughter. We talked about what we want to do, and we're going to leave, if we pass away, we're going to leave all of our assets to Greg and Jerry, and they know to take care of Amanda. They'll take care of her. And I, would respond and say, okay, can we talk a little more about Amanda? What's going on with Amanda? Why has this been discussed as a plan? And the couple would, kind of brush it off and say, well, Amanda's just taking a little longer to get her stuff together. She has some issues going on she's dealing with, and the boys know to take care of her. Just, that's what we've talked about. We decided as a family, that's how it is. A lot of reluctance to share the information. I mean, my being raised, I cannot count how many times my mother said, don't air your dirty laundry. And when I'm meeting with parents, older generation or raised by that generation, there can be reluctance to share things that families view as dirty laundry. So how I would approach this is I would, say to the client, all right, well, it's one option to leave the assets to your sons, with the understanding they'll take care of it for your daughter. but it might not be the best option. And I've worked with other families who have specific concerns. For example, some families might have a child affected by the disease of substance use disorder. In fact, I'm in active recovery myself. And when I'm working with those families, and at this point, clients are going, okay, you're in active recovery, you get this? So our daughter, Amanda, she's a meth addict. She's been to treatment 3 times. She's living in our basement right now. You won't believe what happened last night. And then all of a sudden, I'm getting all the information I need to properly advise this client to have a plan in place that actually serves them, actually serves to meet their goals, and actually serves and supports their children and their loved ones. And, the difference, well, not the difference, but the important piece being is they know that, or they can at least assume that as an individual in recovery, I understand recovery. I understand substance use disorder, alcoholism, addiction, whatever term you use. I understand it as a disease, not a moral failing, not a choice. It's not something, I'm not going to judge their child. It's not something their child did wrong. I'm not going to judge them. It's not something the parents did wrong. I get it. And, I say that because if, for professionals that might be viewing this, that work with clients, it can be so important to just pause and share your experience, whether that's personal experience or just experience you've had in educating yourself, in learning about recovery, learning about substance use disorder, doing things to have a better understanding and reduce your own bias that might exist, or bias that your clients might perceive exists. And it's really when individuals feel safe in sharing that information that professionals can get the details they need to properly advise them. So to kind of just interject quickly, sometimes I talk about estate planning and assume everyone knows what I'm talking about. To back up a little bit, estate planning includes documents such as a trust and or a will, a power of attorney, and a healthcare directive. With a will or a trust, clients are planning what will happen with their assets after they die, where are those assets going, how are they being administered, who's doing that, guardians of minors, there's all sorts of things, but it's all after death planning. A power of attorney is when you can, and by the way, some of these documents might have different names in other states. I'm using the names of the documents as we use them in Minnesota. Power of attorney is a document in which you can designate an individual and give them the legal authority to make financial decisions on your behalf. For example, if you're unable to do so yourself. And a healthcare directive would be where you're naming who can make medical decisions on your behalf if you're unable to make them yourself. Also communicating what those decisions might look like if someone's making your medical decisions. So to go back to addiction trust planning, when I'm working with parents talking about addiction trust planning, I generally start with discussing where are things at right now. We'll stay with the hypothetical of talking about Amanda as the individual affected by substance use disorder. I want to know things like, is Amanda currently active in recovery, or is Amanda currently active in her disease? Is she using? If she is sober, how long has it been? Has she been sober before? Has she gone to treatment? If so, how many times? In what ways are you supporting her now, financially or otherwise? What are your concerns about the future? What are your fears? What are your objectives with this type of planning? And why this is important is it really allows me to understand what the family has done to create a dynamic of support in supporting that child in their recovery, in supporting them in their sobriety, but not enabling their use. And that looks different for every family. What support is needed and what that looks like, it can depend on how it's received by the individual, how their disease specifically is presenting, what type of addiction or mental health challenges we're facing. It also can depend on the values or in how the parents give that type of support. It can come down to what boundaries have been set. But this information is really what's going to be reflected in the addiction trust. It's taking what has been created and what mechanisms and tools are in place and making a plan for that to continue even after parents have passed away. Passing that support for recovery, passing that understanding and that family dynamic, positive family dynamic, on to the next generation. So we'll kind of go back to the hypothetical of a client has suggested we're going to leave everything to the two sons. They know to take care of their sister. Couple immediate concerns with that. One, if I have a client who wants a legal document that says all of my assets to my two sons, and they've had a verbal off to the side conversation with the sons telling them, take care of your sister, why. Well, that verbal agreement, that verbal conversation does not create any legal obligation for those boys to, use that money to support their sister. So that's concern number one. It's a plan that does not have to take place. Concern two, it can really be a burden on the sons. It can really be stressful to that sibling relationship to have it structured that way. All families have dynamic, but families impacted by substance use disorder, and I speak from professional and personal experience, families affected by substance use disorder have dynamic. And they might have years and years and years of dynamic. They might have generations of dynamic. And that stuff bubbles up when there's a death. It bubbles up when trusts are being administered. And to have a daughter who is active in her substance use disorder, she's actively using, go to her brother and say, hey, I know you got all this money from mom, but she told you you're supposed to help me. I need money for X. With no other structure, no other legal structure in place, really creates a rift and puts a huge burden on those individuals. And it can negatively impact that family dynamic, that sibling relationship. So with trust planning, we start with where are we at now, and we're wanting to come up with a plan that, if the client I'm working with, usually parent or parents, if they pass away, how are their assets being used to continue to support and promote their child's recovery and not enable their use or their disease. That is often a big goal. Clients also have the goal of protecting their own assets. They want to make sure that money isn't being wasted or spent quickly, spent in a way that is not beneficial to the beneficiary, spent on drugs and alcohol. They want to protect their assets. And it's also putting a plan in place that does take into consideration the specific details, the specific nuances of the individual with substance use disorder. So one of the first things I talk about with clients after we've addressed, where are things at now, I have a better understanding of the goals, the values of these particular clients, is who's going to be in charge of this trust. Now, how a trust can function is these parents in particular, we'll talk about Amanda again, they can say, if I pass away, I want all of my assets to be split 3 ways. So a third to Greg, a third to Kevin, I think Kevin was the other son's name in my hypothetical, and a third to Amanda. But Amanda's is going to be held in a trust. So she doesn't get that money in her hands. It's not going to go straight to her bank account. It's going to be held on her behalf. And then you have to name someone who's going to manage it, someone who's going to be responsible for answering to Amanda if she asks for assets. I'm generally advising clients to think about using a corporate or professional trustee, a company, a non-family member, or a more removed family member, say an uncle or something like that. Again, this is very fact specific, so it's important to talk with an attorney about this. But naming someone who, if Amanda comes to them and asks for money for rent, they're going to pay her rent directly, not necessarily give her those assets, because they understand the situation, they understand the dynamic. You can also have language in place that sets up rules or specific guidelines in how the trust be administered. So for example, this client could say, the money in trust for Amanda, and half of it can get paid to her when she's achieved 15 years sobriety. Well, at this point, we do need to take a step back and define what sobriety means. That can look different for different clients. Define what recovery means, define what active use looks like. Really taking the time to have a robust plan that is well thought through, well planned out, that will meet the specific concerns and the specific situation. You also, and a lot of parents, this is kind of a primary concern, you can plan for what would happen if that individual were to become active in their disease or be using or relapse. So for example, the trust could be set up that, it pays out, it's going to pay out for the beneficiary for their health, education, maintenance, and support. That is pretty robust. It's going to pay out for a lot. But if that person is using, or if they relapse, become active in their disease, then the trust freezes up and it's only going to pay out directly for recovery resources. So if I have a client that comes in and they say, Amanda, she's in recovery, she's been sober 2 years, we're helping pay her rent because she is doing a lot of recovery work, she's only working part-time right now, she's talking about going back to school. But, if she starts using again, we won't pay her rent. This has happened in the past. She knows that. That's a boundary we set. If she starts using again and she wants to go to another 30 days in a treatment center, or she wants, some other type of recovery service, we'll pay for that. But that's all we're going to pay for in that period. Well, a trust can reflect that. If parent has died, money's being held in a trust, and the beneficiary is using again, this all has to be defined and laid out very clearly. But if the beneficiary is using again, the trustee can be instructed that the trust freezes and it's only going to pay out for recovery resources. So, it's been brought to the trustee's attention, we've administered a UA, whatever methodology or methods are in place to confirm this. It's been brought to the trustee's attention that you're active in your disease. The trust is set up. It's not going to pay your rent. It's not going to pay for you to stay there. But if you'd like to spend 30 days in Center City at Hazelton, the trust will happily pay for that. Again, this looks different for almost every family I work with. I don't think I've done one addiction trust that's looked the same. And this is a very bird's eye view. This seminar is more to educate people that this type of trust planning exists, that it's an option, and that it's a really great option for families to plan in the long term for being able to support and promote their loved one's recovery and not enable their use. And it's also a way to plan to pass on this family structure of support that's been put in place, pass it on through the next generation, pass it on to be there even after you've passed away. I have a individual that I know whose mother passed away and left her assets to her and her brother outright. They each got 50%. Her brother was an addict alcoholic. I believe he had periods of sobriety. Within a few months of mom passing away, he was found dead in a hotel room. And I have numerous examples of this. Because of the work I do and because I talk about this, people share their stories with me. I've had clients come in that have been personally impacted when a loved one inherits a large sum of money. They're living in their disease, they're using. And as most of us know, alcoholism addiction is a disease. And when a person is actively suffering with that disease, it is driving them. It is driving them to use. It is driving them to use every resource every ounce of energy, everything to get that substance. And you put a large sum of money in someone's hand that's really active in that, it can be terminal. It can be a deadly thing. It's a very, very real threat. And clients that come in, that is a thought, that is something they're trying to have a plan of protection in place to at least best they can prevent that, or not enable that to happen. I do free seminars around the Twin Cities area on addiction trust planning. And I stopped by a local coffee shop to see if they'd hang up a flyer I had about an upcoming seminar. It's a coffee shop in St. Paul that's owned by a few gentlemen in recovery. A lot of people from recovery go there, so I thought it was relevant to have this seminar information posted. And there was a young gentleman working there who was probably in his late 20s, early 30s, had a couple years in recovery. He had periods of recovery before, but a year or two in. And I told him about the seminar, and his response amazed me. He said, "Oh my gosh, I had never thought about something like that. I'm going to tell my parents about that, because gosh, if my parents ever were to pass away, I don't know how I would handle that. And I'm doing well right now. And I have a year of sobriety, but I also know how my addiction can come out of nowhere and really just knock me off my feet. And it's kind of nice to know that there can be planning in place that protects me from my disease if that were to happen after such a challenging thing as my parents dying were to happen." And I mean, I was floored, because that's an incredible amount of, self-insight for a young person, especially a young person that's also newer to the recovery community to have. And I also found it really refreshing, because, I'm also a woman in recovery, woman in long-term recovery, and I have the same perspective. I have the same understanding of, my own substance use disorder. And it's really, this work that I do is to work with families to help them have a plan in place to continue supporting their loved ones in their recovery and not enabling their addiction, not, really positioning things to set them up for success. So that is kind of brings to a wrap, what I wanted to share with you about my own story about addiction trust planning. Addiction trust planning is not a topic that it's not a hot topic. I don't hear it talked about much in the legal field, personally, and there's not a lot of information about it, but it is such an important and amazing tool, such an important and amazing process available to families to have in place. And so many families spend so much of their time, emotion, energy, and resources to create an approach or a plan to have in place to support their loved one that has substance use disorder during their lifetime. Do that now, have that in place now, and having addiction trust planning allows you to pass that on, to keep it going even if you were to pass away, which is really amazing. It's a really great thing to be able to do. And again, my passion for it is fueled both professionally as an estate planning attorney, but also because of my personal passion as a woman in recovery and serving that community and working with those families. When looking for an attorney to do this type of planning, I would, strongly recommend that you look for an attorney that really focuses their practice on estate planning. This is a complex and can be complicated type of trust planning. It should be done carefully, thoroughly, and drafted very well in order to actually function and be implemented when it's needed, when and if it's needed. You don't, of course, have to work with an attorney that is a person in recovery, but if that's important to you, you might just call and ask the attorney, what's your experience in doing addiction trust planning? What's your experience with recovery? Have you worked with families impacted by substance use disorder? What types of information will you want from me if I come in about, my loved one suffering from substance use disorder or impacted by substance use disorder? And that will kind of give you an idea of how in depth that attorney is going to go, how robust their documents might be. It's also about finding a good fit with an attorney that is going to go as in depth as you want to go. But again, these are trust documents. It's a type of planning that should be done very intentionally, very thoroughly, and cautiously, and definitely by a licensed professional in the state that you reside in. As I said earlier, I'm located in St. Paul, Minnesota. I serve the Twin Cities metro area primarily, but I work with clients all over the state of Minnesota. I do quarterly free seminars on addiction trust planning. It goes into a lot more detail about what estate planning is, different documents, what they do, and then dives deep into addiction trust planning and fleshing that out a lot more. If you'd like information about those seminars, I do send them out through my mailing list, which you can sign up for on my website, www.schromenlaw.com. It's schromenlaw.com. You can also email me with any questions or inquiries, Rachel, Rachel, at schromenlaw.com. If anyone wants, I have PowerPoint materials of the seminar that I give. Happy to send that out at request to anyone, and just answer any questions you might have and be of service in supporting you in your quest to gain more knowledge about addiction trust planning. So thank you for joining me as I shared more about myself and the work I do as an estate planning attorney. And again, if there are any follow-up questions or there's any way I can help and support you and your family, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you.